Militant empathy. Hey, it's me, your gal, Militant Empathy, back again to regale you with my tales of woe. No, I'm kidding. We'll get to the woe later on. Right now, it's time for the intros. So if you're new to the show, firstly, welcome. We are now best friends forever, no takebacks. Secondly, this is a podcast where I pick a different topic for each episode, wherein each topic hopefully speaks to some kind of big question plaguing society. And then I try and unpick that topic from a range of different angles for like about an hour or so. Ideally, providing you with some innovative insights, but definitely providing you with some tales of woe. If that sounds like your bag, you can find all my other episodes up on all major podcasting platforms and also on YouTube. For this episode, though, as you might have guessed from the title, I'm going to be talking about borders. So now I'm hoping that this is going to be like a real treat for you guys, because once upon a time when I was younger, fresher faced, and more determined to become the next Nicolas Cage and hit cinematic classic National Treasure through my rigorous study of history and determination to save the nation through crime, I was on my way to become a professional migration historian. So in terms of approach that I'm going to take today, I'm going to really come at this question of borders from a pretty straight like history lens, rather than the more philosophy, sociology, political science lenses that I sometimes take in other episodes. Personally, I really like the history approach to this subject, because I think that in the present day, there are some very strong assumptions made about how natural or how long-term the framing of certain issues around migration has been. And history can be a useful tool to challenge those assumptions in a very like facts not feeling way that should appeal to the men folk among us. Not the women though, because we famously only care about feelings. Sorry, gals. So one such assumption that is really prevalent nowadays is assuming that we should have very harsh controls on our borders, and that this has always been how things have been, and that those who advocate for more open borders or highlight the, God forbid, social construction of borders are these kind of airy-fairy, borderline insane idealists who are just ignoring the reality of how human societies have always operated. But when we look at the history of borders and the history of human movement, we realize that these very militarized migration control systems that we do see today are in fact the anomaly. And the norm has actually been throughout the vast majority of human history, a high degree of human movement across highly permeable borders. So I'm going to give a long historical overview of borders and border control, focusing particularly on the UK. I'll split the show broadly into 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to be looking really at the origin of borders, so it's a bit more abstract, a bit more theoretical. Then in part 2, I'm going to get more concrete and look at the very first Border Control Act in the UK. Then in part 3, I'm going to talk about the post-war era, the Windrush generation, and a lot of the other like big ticket items in UK migration history. So to get us started, let's think about what comes to mind when you think about the word borders. For me, and most likely for many people, what comes to mind first is border control, right? And generally what we understand by the term border is the geographical space in which access in or out of a territory is controlled, whether that be in passport control at the airport, at a harbor, or on some kind of physical land border. A lot of historians place the origin of these kinds of borders with the quarantine measures implemented by coastal European city-states in the late 1300s, in the wake of the first major outbreak of the bubonic plague, which had occurred between 1347 and 1351. Now, obviously, there is plenty of history of individuals or groups of people being expelled from a territory before this, usually relating to things like religious difference or social stigma. But this notion of processing people at the border, this notion of the border as a physical space, this move towards systemic border control, which all arrivals are subject to in that physical space, is something historians have located with these early attempts to contain what was essentially an early example of a mass pandemic, which might be a bit of a harrowingly familiar subject for us now in the 2020s, so strap in. Now, I'm about to get into a not ungraphic description of the symptoms of the Black Plague, so if you're like eating a meal or something whilst listening to this, I would suggest finishing your meal first before proceeding with the podcast. So the bubonic plague, or Black Death as it's sometimes known, was a pretty fucking big deal in the late Middle Ages. In terms of how the disease first spread to humans, this had a lot to do with the expansion of urban centers and high-density housing, which had caused essentially a massive rat problem through a lot of Europe since, as you can probably imagine, given that it was a time when people were probably bathing like at most once a week, waste management systems of these urban centers in the late Middle Ages were not enormously sophisticated.